Okay, tervetuloa, welcome. My name is Antti Leinonen and I'm going to be a moderator for this discussion. But before we start, we have here for the behalf of the University of Oulu, Kuisma Korhonen, who is Dean of Education in Humanities faculty, and he's going to say a couple of words and welcome us.
Yes. Welcome all this Veritas Forum on behalf of all University and Faculty of Humanities. The title of this forum, I guess, is Science and Christianity. And I could also see the title in plural, because in fact I think there are several versions of scientific thought and several versions of Christianity. And this topic, of course, is quite important here in Oulu region, where there are certainly very long Christian traditions, but also very strong scientific traditions. So I don't want to disturb you more, but welcome very heartily to this forum. Thank you.
As said, the theme of this forum is Science and Christianity, Worldviews in Conflict, ? There will be two presentations, about 20 minutes each. And after that, there is to both of the speakers 5 to 7 minutes time to respond to each other. And after that, there is a time for questions from the audience. First speaker is Ari Helo. Ari is a university lecturer in the History of Science and Ideas program here at the University of Oulu. His PhD was in the University of Tampere, and his doctoral dissertation was about Thomas Jefferson's political thought and the problem of slavery. And the second speaker is Peter Payne. Peter and his wife Janet, who is also with him, they live in Mount Hermon in California. And Peter is the managing director of the Institute for Credible Christianity. And his PhD is in philosophy. And Peter has spoken in Veritas Forum in the States. So let us now welcome both to the forum, and we will give microphone first to Ari Helo.
Ladies and gentlemen, there was a question in the invitation to this discussion. Given the success of natural sciences, how does the God of Christianity fit into modern naturalism? Whether there is a problem between religion and science depends on what one thinks about God and what counts as a scientific worldview. I'm an academic historian, not a scientist in the strict sense of the term, but as a mere historian, I don't actually think that speaking about God belongs to university. We should rather speak of supernatural beliefs and religions. That is not to say that I wish to contradict myself by attending this discussion. I think it is important to make it clear why university teachers should not act as priests or psychiatrists or consultants for students or for the public regarding questions of identity formation, religious issues being part of that. Universities are organizations for teaching, studying, and doing research about the world as it unfolds to us via scientific thinking and methodology. There is no scientifically valid method to establish religious truths, which is why academics tend to have very little to say about the God or gods, besides that such ideas are very common in every human culture. Religious institutions have a different purpose from those of academic research. To be sure, in the human sciences, we constantly address questions that are related to that of the meaning of life. But university teachers are not supposed to offer answers to such questions. The point is to teach the numerous and hugely varying answers that has been given to such questions in the course of human history. The main purpose is to teach the technique of asking relevant questions, because there is such huge amount of answers available, and 90% of them is pure rubbish, often harmful. All in all, I would question the very idea that we somehow evidently face a challenge to reconcile science with religion. There is no self-evident relation between the two to begin with. You may put together such a relation only if you begin with the religion part of the equation. Sciences and critical studies in the humanities do not need any religious foundation as such. Let me elaborate on this. It is totally a different thing to say, for example, that I have faith in humankind or I have faith in morality, from saying, for example, that I believe in God, Christian or non-Christian. Most important, if I say that I have a faith in something about the world, say that I believe in scientific progress, that does not mean that I am automatically a religious person. Atheists, agnostics, and the like believe in great many things, even if not in God. And if one does not believe that there is something like God, one is not in need to have a position about such a non-being at all, of course. All we need in this respect is freedom of conscience. So whatever is your personal relationship to God is no business of your university teacher. Because in academic discussions we are dealing with what to think about the world as we all can perceive it. Please note, none of this is to say that a person would need to deny one's own deepest religious beliefs in order to be a first-rate academic. The point is simply to keep God out of campus in terms of research. Let me resort to a historical example, historian as I am, about what is at stake here. And let us go back to the 18th century for a while. By and large, the modern understanding of scientific research has its roots in the 18th century Enlightenment. The author of the American Declaration of Independence, the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, has often been seen as an embodiment of the American Enlightenment, particularly because of his strong belief in scientific progress. In Jefferson's eyes, mankind appeared to be taking steps forward in knowledge, in material welfare, and even in morality. But the essential point about Jefferson's typical 18th century optimism about the human future lies in the commitment to the Baconian notion of increasing knowledge. This very commitment gains its meaning from the notion that something significant, now unknown, may remain in the essentially unforeseeable future. This is why, at any given present, the person who believes in increasing knowledge claims to know less rather than more. Here we have a picture of Thomas Jefferson. Now, to illustrate the seminal importance of the distinction between knowing and believing, let us consider Thomas Jefferson's letter to another American president, John Adams. This letter is from 1823, when both men had long ago retired from the presidential office and were now interested in philosophical rather than political issues. They both can be characterized as typical 18th century deists. Jefferson's 1823 letter includes his most unequivocal assertion of there being an intelligent agent behind observable, constantly regenerating nature and the universe. What Jefferson wrote to Adams is this: Every Christian sect gives a great handle to atheism by their general dogma that without a revelation there would not be a sufficient proof of the being of a God. Jefferson then offers a long list of all possible evidence of God's existence as a kind of a superintending power to maintain the universe in its course. Then he says this, the other paragraph. So irresistible are these evidences of an intelligent and powerful agent that of the infinite numbers of men who have existed through all time, they have believed in the proportion of 1,000,000 at least to a unit, in the hypothesis of an eternal pre-existence of a creator, rather than in that of a self-existent universe. Surely this unanimous sentiment renders this more probable than that of the few in the other hypothesis. In fact, Jefferson here speaks of two different hypotheses, one held by deists and the second one held by only a handful of atheists. So there are two fundamental hypotheses, one of divine ordering of the universe and the other of a self-existent universe. Considering the probability of each in terms of majority opinion, gave in Jefferson's account preference to the design hypothesis. But Jefferson was not arguing that knowledge is a matter of majority opinion. He had no intention to deny that empirical induction was the simplest, scientifically valid method of seeking the truth. Indeed, in the same letter, he also refers to the idea of the Creator as a being, I quote, a being whom we see not and know not, of whose form, substance, and mode or place of existence or of action no sense informs us. In sum, neither hypothesis had anything to do with what an empiricist could hold certain. Jefferson's reasoning about the more probable hypothesis, based as it was on common consent only, was distinguishable from what he thought any given individual should consider reasonable to believe about these kind of issues. And indeed, Jefferson was remarkably consistent in distinguishing his personal beliefs even about morality from that on which he thought all should agree, or at least could agree. You are all familiar with Jefferson's statement that all men are entitled to the natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. While Jefferson later referred to happiness as the very aim of life, he never defined the term happiness. He sometimes referred to the Epicurean notion of tranquility as the greatest good of life, but he could just as easily proclaim that every American is free to aspire to the happiness of man, I quote, to aspire to the happiness of man here and his greater happiness hereafter, end of quote. In sum, Jefferson here neither denied his own belief in the afterlife, nor insisted that the concept of human happiness entails such a belief. Let us finally take a look at Jefferson, at another letter by Jefferson. This one was written to his young protege, 17-year-old Peter Carr. It is from 1787. Jefferson kept on sending books to Peter on every possible subject: mathematics, history, religion, ethics, literature, astronomy, and philosophy. But this is what he wrote about the issue of religious studies to this young 17-year-old Peter Carr. Religion. Your reason is now mature enough to examine this object. Fix reason firmly in her seat, and call to her tribunal every fact, every opinion. Question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more approve the homage of reason than that of a blindfolded fear. These questions are examined in the books I have mentioned under the head of religion and several others. They will assist you in your inquiries, but keep your reason firmly in the watch in reading them all. Do not be frightened from this inquiry by any fear of its consequences. If it ends in a belief that there is no God, You will find incitements to virtue in the comfort and pleasantness you feel in its exercise and the love of others which it will procure you. Your own reason is the only oracle given by heaven, and you are answerable not for the rightness but uprightness of the decision. In sum, Jefferson insisted that your reason is the only oracle given by you by heaven for considering religious issues, even if you would end up with a belief that there is no God. And the moral point was that on this issue, you are answerable not for the rightness but uprightness of the decision. What could this mean? The doctrine is actually very simple. If you do not, first of all, be true to yourself, you may be untrue to others. In view of such an appeal to an individual's conscience alone, Jefferson claims that the human essence is Jefferson's claims about the human essence are decidedly modest. They did not depend on whether or not the human being has a soul to be saved even. Personally, Jefferson claimed to be a Christian. He believed in God. But when depicting himself as a free moral agent, he insisted above all on having, and I quote, never submitted the whole system of my opinions to the creed of any party of men, whatever in religion, in philosophy, in politics, or in anything else. Jefferson's intellectual outlook was resolutely and exclusively secular, regardless of his own religious beliefs. To conclude, as for academic research and parlance, any argument that is derived from one or another notion of a divine, physical, or moral ordering of the world is automatically invalid. This is not to deny that there may be such a unified ordering and some kind of an extra-human intelligence guaranteeing such an ordering. The point is simply that any argument derived from the assumption that there is such a being cannot be taken as interpersonally valid research hypothesis. Whatever is suggested as a research hypothesis must be something that can also be put to an empirical test. This is why science does not even seek to answer the question why, but only that of how. Thank you.
Okay. We thank Ari, and then we give Peter his chance to give his speech.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm also thankful to be interacting with Ari. Actually, I think both of us are committed to the importance of reason. The question is, can reason reasonably exclude anything supernatural? Says the academy can have nothing to do with the supernatural whatsoever. That sounds a bit dogmatic. And you have to ask, why is it that people would exclude God from the academy? Why is it the supernatural can have no place in the academy? I think one of the strongest reasons for believing that is the case is the thought that science has shown us that God does not exist, or if God exists at all, he is no better than the deist God. The deist God is the God who created the world and just lets it run. So what I'd like to do in my presentation is to explore a little bit the question, does science really tell us that God does not exist or that God is just a deist? Does the success of science show us that? I'll start off with an illustration from Pierre Laplace. Pierre Laplace was a tutor for Napoleon, that world conqueror. And Pierre Laplace wrote a book on the solar system. And the story has it that Napoleon either read the book or heard about the content of the book. And he came to his teacher, Laplace, and he said, Laplace, I'm very impressed by your book. But I would like to know why it is in a book on the solar system you make no reference to God. And Laplace's response was, I have no need of that hypothesis. And I think that captures many people's view of God today. Wherever you look in the world around us, from the smallest scale to the largest scale, it appears as though science is able to explain what we see around us, since there's no need for that hypothesis. One needs to ask, is there an underlying assumption here? Is the assumption that if God exists, then surely there must be gaps in the order of nature that God needs to fill? Now, why should one assume that that is the case? Oftentimes Christians have argued that. In fact, I remember one time hearing a preacher make the contention that science is unable to account for cellular differentiation, how cells divide. So a stem cell divides, becomes more stem cells, but at some point, a stem cell becomes 2 muscle cells. Or a muscle cell divides and becomes 2 different muscle cells than the original muscle cell. And his contention was, here's something that science is unable to account for, therefore God must do it. A classic example of the God of the gaps hypothesis. But I think such gaps are not only wrong, I think they're inconsistent with Christian belief. And that Christians should not assume that we will find gaps within the order of nature that science has not yet discovered. And I'll explain a little more about order of nature, but let me give another example. Isaac Newton thought that God needed every once in a while to adjust the orbits of the planets to keep them stable. His reason for thinking that was that he recognized that planets have a gravitational effect upon each other. And he thought that over time, that would destabilize the orbits of the planets, and God needs to occasionally stabilize them so they keep in stable orbits. Now, if you were a Christian at the time of Isaac Newton, you might say, even the great Isaac Newton, even though he has this mechanistic universe, recognizes there's a need for God, and God needs to adjust things to keep the universe functioning. Well, one of the accomplishments of Pierre Laplace 100 years later was to show that Isaac Newton was wrong. One of the accomplishments in his book was to show that, yes, in fact, the planets have a gravitational effect upon one another. But if you do your physics calculations properly, they cancel one another out over time. So the orbit of the Earth does vary slightly, and it's very difficult to predict exactly where it will be, but physics tells us that the orbit will be stable. Now, if you were a Christian at the time of Pierre Laplace, you might think, oh no, here I thought at least God needs to maintain the stability of the planetary orbits, and here he's shown that no, that's not needed at all, that physics accounts for it. Now, should a Christian be distressed for that, or should a Christian continue to look for places in the world around us where there are gaps in the normal order of nature where science is unable to fill those gaps? And I would maintain not only is it compatible with the Christian faith that there are no gaps in the normal order of nature, it should not be at all surprising from what we understand from the Bible about the character of God. Go back to Isaac Newton and the planetary orbits. If God's all-powerful, he can create any possible world. Surely he could have chosen to create a world where he needs to adjust the orbits of the planets to keep them stable. God, however, is a God who's all-knowing, and he knows all the possibilities. And one of the possibilities, because it's actual, is a world where physics dictates the stability of the planetary orbits. Now, normally it's rather shaky for us to say, what would I do if I were God? If I were omnipotent and omniscient, what kind of world would I create? But at least from a human perspective, if you're an engineer and you're creating a machine and you have the choice of creating a self-adjusting machine or a machine that needs to be adjusted on an annual basis, and suppose that cost is not a factor, certainly as an engineer, the more elegant solution is to build a self-adjusting machine. What I suggest, when God looks at this world, he obviously could create a world which is exquisitely ordered from the largest scale to the smallest scale without any need for God to do regular or periodic miracles to sustain it. Now again, if from a human standpoint it would make sense to create such a marvelously self-ordered world, why do we assume that God surely would create a world where he needs to make adjustments to keep it running? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense if one thinks God's all-powerful and all-knowing. Now, my non-Christian friends would say, okay, I can see how you're giving an argument here that from a Christian perspective of God, the success of science is not a big surprise. But he says, it sounds to me as though your view of God is basically the deist view of God. That God sets the universe running and then everything happens by the laws of physics and everything is dictated by that. Well, I want to maintain that no, that's not the case, and I want to make a distinction between what I'll call the order of nature and specific events. The order of nature are the processes by which things take place. An example of the order of nature would be understanding how a fetus develops in a mother's womb. So that's the process, and geneticists and biologists and others seek to understand how that takes place. But contrast that with a specific birth of a specific child to a specific woman, okay? The scientist typically does not concern himself with the specifics. The scientist wants to know about the process. Now, I want to make a distinction built on these two notions of order of nature and specific events, a distinction between what I'll call order of nature miracles and specific event miracles. If God needs to adjust the orbits of the planets, that would be an order of nature miracle. If the virgin birth took place, that would be an example of a specific point miracle. And my contention is that if science knows exactly, we don't know exactly, there's an awful lot to learn, but suppose that we got to a point where we knew step by step everything that takes place from conception, the multiplying of stem cells to the baby being born, and no point along the line do you see a miracle taking place. Would that tell you that God can never do miracles at specific points for specific times? No, it doesn't. Well, one might say, well, if God creates an exquisitely ordered universe, why would he ever make exceptions to the laws of physics? Well, if God is an agent, like the Bible says, and has intentions, we certainly shouldn't preclude that. I mean, after all, from our standpoint, if you make a machine which is self-adjusting, you might want to change that machine from time to time, while at the same time the machine runs perfectly well. So there's a distinction between order of nature and no gaps or places that science couldn't possibly explain, and history within which the contention is that God, in fact, can do miracles within human history. In fact, if you look at the miracles of the Bible, none of the miracles are miracles which are order of nature miracles. The creation event was sort of an event which started everything. If you look at the miracles in the Bible, they were miracles that took place at a specific point, specific time. Never are they a substitute for science. So if you think science has shown that God doesn't exist because there are no gaps in the order of nature, you need a further inference, a further step from that to say that if we have no gaps in the order of nature, then we have good reason to believe there are no gaps within history. There are no miracles within history, or God never intervenes within history. But that really is not a good jump to make. And from a Christian standpoint, there's plenty of reasons why God would do those steps. And there's plenty of cases where people have said God has done miracles. If you're someone like David Hume would say, you should not ever believe in a miracle, no matter how impressive the evidence is, because you're believing in something which is impossible. You're believing something which is contrary to the laws of physics, and nothing is more established than the laws of physics. But no, if you believe in God, you can believe completely in the laws of physics, and you can believe that there's an order of nature which God has created, and that it will unfold according to the laws of physics, but that doesn't tell you that God will not ever intervene. And if he does intervene, the laws of physics are not negated. It simply means that God has created an exception. If the virgin birth was true, God made an exception to the normal process of human birth. In fact, it's a huge exception to it. It's not just a slight change to get a whole other set of DNA combined with Mary's DNA. Is a rather massive miracle, but nothing in science tells us that that cannot happen. Okay, so my contention is that one thesis is that given the God of the Bible, one should not expect to find gaps in the order of nature. I think science gives us at least a good argument for saying there are no gaps. We don't know that for certain, particularly when it comes to questions of mind and consciousness and free will and all those kinds of things. There's some major problems that science has in dealing with that, but set those aside and think of everything else. It seems as though science is able to account for everything around us. But that should not preclude us from saying that God acts within human history, that it does do miracles. Now, there are three objections that I want to mention, actually four objections, and I'll bring my talk to a conclusion. And the first objection is to say if God does miracles at all, shouldn't one expect miracles to happen frequently, enough so that everyone is aware of them? Well, part of the answer to that is if miracles are done by the will of an agent, there is no a priori or ahead of time reason for assuming that this agent, this being will do them often or not. God might choose to do miracles, obvious miracles, frequently or hardly ever. So simply from the standpoint of theism, step back from Christian theism, the notion that there's a God who could do miracles in history, there's no antecedent reason for thinking that he's going to do them often enough that they'll be obvious to all of us. Another response to the question of frequency is if you look at the Bible, obvious miracles don't occur on a regular basis. So if the atheist says, well, if God exists, he surely should do an obvious miracle for me. Well, if you look at the Bible, obvious miracles only happen through particular individuals in particular periods of time. And there's long periods of time where no obvious miracles take place. That doesn't mean that God is not at work. But from the Bible standpoint, there are not obvious miracles on a regular basis, and why should we think there be obvious miracles today? Now, if you believe in faith healing, and I think God does heal, you find a number of remarkable stories about faith healing. One example, I have a friend who is a surgeon, attends the church we attend in California, and he decided a couple years ago to start praying for his patients. He has cancer patients come to him before he does the surgery, so he does an exam with them. Just before the surgery is done, they have a CAT scan to see if the cancer is still there or the tumor is still there, and then they remove it. So this woman came into him and had a tumor the size of a lemon, and he said, do you mind if I pray for you? And so he said, okay. So he prayed for her, and he prayed this. He said, God, I pray that when this tumor comes out, that we will discover that it's benign and not malignant. Or I pray that this tumor will simply disappear before the time of the surgery. A week later, she came in for a CAT scan, and it was completely gone. Well, I'm a philosopher, so I'm a skeptic, and so I went up to him and said, how long was it before she saw you that the last CAT scan was done? I mean, after all, the immune system can attack growths, cancer cells, that kind of thing. And he says about 3 weeks. Well, did God do something there? If you believe in God, probably you say yes. If you don't believe in God, you say, well, it's extraordinary, but perhaps the immune system simply worked very quickly and got rid of it in that period of time. Seems to me that God does lots of things, which if you believe God exists at all, are quite evident manifestations of his work within the world. But for whatever reason, God doesn't do obvious miracles very often. A second objection that people would give is that we do know things about God from the Bible. He supposedly wants us to know that he's there. So shouldn't he make himself more obvious? And if he cares about human suffering, shouldn't he alleviate human suffering more often than he does? Why doesn't he heal everyone who prays or has a great deal of faith? Why is it that it's sort of hit and miss? You see some dramatic healings, then you don't see healings. Why doesn't God do obvious miracles more often? My response to that objection is that those are very good questions. Actually, within philosophy, it's the problem of evil and the problem of the hiddenness of God. But I want to note that they don't arise out of science itself. Science has no difficulty with suffering. It's only if you introduce character of God, with which God cares about it, that it becomes a problem. So it's not science that creates the problem. It's another philosophical, theological question which gives rise to that. I'm not going to try to address that today. However, I also want to note that if you do have good reason to believe that God has done some miracles or a miracle, you're not understanding why God doesn't do them more often. It does not negate the evidence you have. So you have to ask the question, are there any instances of miracles which do have a really quite significant amount of evidence behind them? If you research it, you'll find that in fact they are. In fact, David Hume in his essay on miracles acknowledges that there are some reports of miracles which were quite remarkably well attested to. But his contention is because of a miracle, you have to have this extremely high bar of evidence, and it fails. I won't get into it at this point, but I think all the philosophical arguments that say your bar for believing in miracles has to be incredibly high is driven by the assumption that God simply doesn't exist, the miracles can't happen. It's not driven by the success of science. It's not driven by any logic within itself. It really is assuming the conclusion. You assume that they can't happen, so therefore you put the bar way up here. Now, you should be suspicious about miracle reports, the same way in which people who claim UFOs, you should be suspicious of them. In fact, one of the arguments is to say, well, science has debunked many miracle reports, so doesn't that give us reason for believing that miracles never happen? Actually, no, that's not the case, because miracle reports are something you would expect whether or not God does exist. Think of the UFO example. People talk about that you have all these reports of UFOs, and we've shown that many of them are false or there's natural explanations for them. Does that show there cannot be any actual aliens? Well, most atheists actually say there could be aliens. The fact that we have many debunked reports tells us nothing about whether there are genuine ones that are there. In fact, if there were a genuine, it wouldn't go in the category of possibly genuine. They don't say that. It's debunked and not yet conclusive. So you have non-conclusive, so no genuine reported miracle ever gets in the positive column, so there's the debunkings. But it really tells us nothing about whether or not miracles actually have taken place. What it does is it tells us we need to have a higher bar of evidence when it comes to believing a miracle than not, simply because there are so many bogus reports that are out there. I think I haven't been keeping track of time. I think probably my 20 minutes is about done.
You've taken 15 minutes so far.
Oh, I've got a little more time. Very good. Okay, so another objection that a person could give would be say, okay, suppose now that what you believe is right. As Christians, you don't simply believe that God occasionally does an obvious miracle. You believe that God works in your life on a fairly regular basis. So when Christians pray and they feel God's guidance and they feel God's presence, they feel like God is actually having an influence on them. Well, I think anytime you have an emotion or a thought, things are going on in your brain. And if God's affecting your emotions and your thoughts, then God has to be affecting your brain. So God has to be having an actual cause within the physical world, even to be able to encourage Christians or guide them or direct them. The question is, if one thinks that there is a gapless order of nature, how is it that God, on any kind of regular basis or frequent basis, can guide Christians or give them instruction or help them in various ways? And my response to that is to say, well, God can act in several ways. In addition to obvious miracles, which I don't think he does very often, at least I've never come across an obvious miracle myself. I've heard a few reports, and I'd like to have more information about them. But when you hear about healing meetings, you don't have someone whose arm is missing, and they pray for the person, the arm comes out. Or they have back pains and a variety of other things where the person is healed, but it's not obvious miracles. It's not clear that there was exception to the laws of physics. But in addition to that, clearly God can do what I call micro miracles. Possible example of a micro miracle is I have a friend who's a Christian musician, and he had done one album, a rather cheaply done production in an amateur studio. And he had the opportunity to do his next album in this professional studio with professional musicians through personal connections of a friend coming in, and this one opportunity to pull off this really top-notch album. Well, the night before this was to take place, he got a phone call at 2 a.m. from a friend on the East Coast. He's on the West Coast, and his friend said, "I'm sorry to call you. I know it's 2 a.m. where you are." You don't normally do that, even the States. People aren't that rude. You don't call people at 2 a.m. in the morning and say, I just was thinking about you. But he said, I was thinking about you, and it seemed as though I ought to be praying for you, and I finally decided to call and see if there's something I should pray for you about. And my friend said, well, actually, yes. There's this major recording that's taking place tomorrow. It's the one shot. If it goes well, fine. If it doesn't go, that's my one opportunity. Now, how is it that he pray, or how is it that he got this compulsion that he needs to call my friend in California? Well, it seems to me that God would have to work in his brain, but it wouldn't be any obvious kind of way. A person who is not a believer would say, well, that's just coincidence. Those kind of coincidences happen. And I grant you from a philosophical perspective, that's not, but there's lots of instances of things that happen that seem to be more than just coincidences. And some are cases that aren't easy to chalk up to mere coincidences. So God can, in fact, work through micro-miracles, or God can work through quantum indeterminacy. So quantum indeterminacy says that the future is not actually dictated by the present. There's a probability and things unfold. If that's the case, there's a flexibility within the universe where God can guide things without doing any miracles at all, without any exception to laws of physics, not even micro ones. Now, my skeptical friend would say to me, that sounds like intellectual cheating. Here you don't see any obvious miracles done by God, and so you say, well, God is doing a miracle where I would never be able to observe it. So since you don't see any actual evidence of God doing things in an obvious way, you're going to say, well, he works in ways that even theoretically I could not observe. So working through quantum indeterminacy is theoretically impossible to be able to show that God actually brought that about. And my response to that is that, yes, that would be intellectual cheating if, in fact, I have no good reason for believing that God has actually worked in the world. And if you are a Christian, you've probably had lots of instances within which you're convinced that God actually has acted in the world. And if you look at, for me as being a skeptic, look at the more spectacular and unusual cases, if that has happened, then God can act even when it's not an obvious miracle which was involved. So if I have reason to believe that God has acted, it's not important to me. I have no obligation to be able to say how God did it, but rather if I could show that God could do it, then there's no scientific reason for saying God didn't do it. So I'm going to conclude at this point by saying when we ask, is there a conflict between science and Christianity? One way of addressing that is to say, well, look at the conflicts in the Bible. What about Genesis 1? But I don't think that's really the issue. The issue is not whether there's supposed conflicts between something the Bible says. The question is the issue between the worldviews of Christianity and science. And does science itself, apart from philosophical, theological arguments brought in, does science itself give us good reason to believe that God never acts within history? And my contention is no, it does not. If a person wants to say there is a conflict, one has to push it in a different direction. But most atheists think the sheer success of science itself shows that God does not exist and the physical world is all that's there. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, as I said, we have for both of the speakers 5 minutes of time to respond to each other. And first is Ari's turn.
But as to the contents, I would like to ask about this idea of miracles. How do you actually define them? Can they be positive, or rather, can they be negative miracles?
Yeah, I think miracles can be defined in the sense of being an actual exception to the laws of physics, something that would not happen in the normal course of nature if it were left to itself. And those can be either small or those can be large. There are other things in a weaker sense within which, by timing, it seems as though there was no exception to the laws of physics, but it seems to be an indication that God was at work. So, for instance, when Moses led the people of Israel across the Jordan River, some people have suggested that a bank upstream might have collapsed, blocked up the Jordan River, and they were able to go across. There would be no miracle. But if you think of miracle as being something which is clearly indicative of God's action, I think the Jews at that time would have said, yes, in fact, God acted, and hence call that a miracle in the weaker sense of miracle. So I'm thinking of miracle in the stronger sense, typically, where it's things that would not happen in the normal course of nature, and one can think of those as being obvious miracles, where everyone would be aware of it. But if God, in fact, works in more subtle ways throughout the world and in people's lives, there's no need for God to do obvious miracles. The question is, does he work at all?
All right, but you mean that whenever God intervenes, it has to be something very, very positive?
Oh. Actually, God, if you take seriously the Bible, there was a time when two of Aaron's sons were playing around with the incense and doing things they weren't supposed to do, and lightning comes down from heaven or fire comes down from heaven and consumes them. That wasn't particularly positive for them, if you believe that happened.
Right. So miracles can be...
Not necessarily positive. Not necessarily.
All right, okay. What I came to think about miracles was one stunning fact about the human history after the Second World War is that we have not yet had a nuclear war. I would say that that's a miracle enough. Miracle enough for me.
Do you want to respond to anything?
Yes, one of the arguments that given is that one ought to be skeptical, and so skeptical that religious belief doesn't enter in. You made the contention you didn't think that religious belief should enter into academic discussion. One might say that is the case by defining scientific method in such a way that scientific method only addresses natural causes. However, it seems as though at least as important as looking for natural causes within a scientific outlook of the world is to be open to wherever the evidence leads. And for a person to dogmatically say, well, as a scientist, I can never grant that a miracle took place, even if you gave me very, very good evidence for it, I could never believe it. Maybe I believe it, but not as a scientist. That seems a little odd to me, but certainly science typically looks for natural causes, and a person wants to define science that way. But it's important to recognize that scientific method is not the only legitimate form of reasoning. In fact, scientific method is part of a broader form of reasoning, which philosophers called inference to the best explanation. Inference to the best explanation sometimes involves scientific reasoning, sometimes not. Scientific reasoning basically works on being able to say, if this hypothesis is correct, then I should expect to find something that I have not yet observed, and then go out to see if it's the case. And it may be a laboratory experiment, it may be digging the ground, looking somewhere. If you find what your hypothesis predicted, that helps reinforce the hypothesis. If you don't, it causes the person to go back and say, well, maybe my hypothesis was right, or more likely, there's a modification in the hypothesis. Rarely does an observation completely overthrow a hypothesis. But the genius of that scientific method is it forces speculations to meet actual fact and get modified by that fact. What is not needed, what needs to be recognized is that frequently we do not have a situation where there's further data which is able to confirm or disconfirm. So for instance, in history, if you have a set of data with regard to some particular question you're investigating, and you have good reason to think this is all the data there is, you don't say, well, I can't give a reasonable explanation because I can't postulate something I haven't observed and find it. If you have sufficient data, it's perfectly reasonable to say this is the best explanation. So inference to the best explanation does not require empirical testing. If it did, then much of history would be out the window, because much of history does not depend on being able to make further experiments. All the data you've got is the data that you've uncovered. If it's good data and it supports one explanation better than the others, it's very reasonable to accept that. When you look at the Christian faith, the reasons that are given for the Christian faith are typically not ones that can be investigated scientifically. If a person says that the Holy Spirit led him to do something, there's no way of looking at the person's brain and saying, yes, you're right, the Holy Spirit was there. Or if there were healings, which are obvious healings, Jesus walks on water, or some other things like that. Well, how is it that we could ever test that? Now there, it's not a matter of our having very much evidence for it. But there are things like the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, which I don't think are open to scientific test. And you can't say, well, if Jesus really rose from the dead, then we should find an empty casket somewhere. Or if he didn't, then we should find a casket that has Jesus Christ written on it with bones inside. But even if you found that, it wouldn't be clear that those were the bones of Jesus. There wouldn't be any good scientific test of it. But you can ask the question, what kind of historical evidence do you have for it? I raised the example of the resurrection of Jesus because if you set to one side the philosophical question about miracles, and just ask the question, what are the different explanations that are out there to explain for the resurrection of Jesus? None of the naturalistic explanations seem very plausible. So one might say, when one looks at the historical case, there's a strong case for the resurrection of Jesus, but in fact, one has to ask the philosophical question, but this is a miracle. And miracles surely have to take more evidence than ordinary events. So that raised the philosophical question, how much does the event need to be? And I think that if we're open-minded, we ought to look at individual events and ask what kind of evidence is there for them rather than go into them with a bias that says no academic person can take this seriously or no historian could possibly take seriously a claim of an event, because after all, that would be unacademic. Rather, the person should have a degree of skepticism and say, unless there's very strong evidence that a miracle has taken place, I won't even entertain that possibility. But if there is strong evidence, then the person has to say, okay, well, who knows? If they're not religious at all, they'll probably say, no, it's not. I don't want an explanation at this point. But I think it'd be academically rather brash to say, well, one cannot possibly think that this was reasonably something brought about by God. That's an open question, and I think that ought to be an open question in the academy.
Okay, now it's time for questions. And I ask that you keep your questions quite short as you can, and also make a question so that it can be answered some way. Okay, now anyone first there?
Okay, thanks for interesting presentations. I'm a historian. I don't believe in miracles. And I don't use religious ideas or beliefs when I try to explain historical phenomena. And that is the reason I don't think it's proper to say, as you, Dr. Peter, said in your title, Science and Christianity, Worldviews in Conflict. You have a question mark there.
Yes.
Problem from my point of view is that science is not a worldview. Christianity is a worldview. Science is a systematic mode of inquiry. When you're trying to find out facts about nature, material nature, human nature, facts, and then theories based on these facts or observations that have given you these temporary facts. They are not absolute truths. Whereas Christianity is a worldview. It gives you a set of beliefs by which you can live. And there are very many religious scientists in the world. Very many, even in Finland. But what they usually do, they keep their beliefs to themselves in their private lives. They don't take these beliefs to their scientific practice. They don't try to explain biological phenomena or historical phenomena with the help of God or any other supernatural phenomena. So in that sense, I think you have to differentiate between science and Christianity. Christianity is the worldview, indeed, but science is not. I don't think it's not. So how do you see that?
Okay, I just repeat for the tape some points. So there was that science is not a worldview, and Christianity definitely is a worldview. That science is just an inquiry for knowledge, and Christianity, it has a set of beliefs, and science does not have.
Actually, Ari and I both agree the science is not a worldview. But you do commonly hear people talk about the scientific worldview, and what they mean by that is not science, what they mean by that is naturalism. Naturalism is the view that the physical world is all that exists. No, scientific methodology does not warrant the step from science to naturalism. All right? If one says one can do that but has no place in the academy, then naturalists should not be advancing their position in the academy if we're going to be limited by what science is able to demonstrate. But naturalism is a worldview. It goes beyond simply what science demonstrates and says there's nothing supernatural whatsoever. And clearly science cannot demonstrate that there's nothing supernatural whatsoever. And particularly if it's true that the order of nature doesn't have any gaps, one shouldn't be expecting it to demonstrate that there's something supernatural in the near future. And even when you have reports of things which are quite dramatic, they're not going to be reported as being supernatural unless someone's already convinced of that. So yes, I do believe that science is not a worldview. It is an important sense of methodology. But the question becomes, who defines what scientific methodology is? If you went back 100 years, people would not say science by its methodological procedure will never invoke God. They would say science by its methodological procedure looks at the data, asks what's the best inference that we give for it, and let's try to explain it. And you actually can begin to explore a claim of a miracle. You can say, if it's a miracle, then one should not expect to find other things that you might find if it were not a miracle. But it's much harder to actually establish or confirm that kind of a belief. I think you're right, the historian should not be invoking miracles. Because after all, unless they're an obvious miracle, and I'm suggesting that obvious miracles don't happen very often, for me to say that Thomas Jefferson did something because God gave him an idea, well, I don't know that God gave him an idea. So for me to invoke that within history is something which I am not in a position to be able to do. And since most things happen, I presume, through natural processes and not because of some God doing some miracle, it's hard for me to see those instances where an academic historian can be justified in saying this is something which God actually did. Now, there are times when historians have said, I think this is something which God was doing, but they already believed in God. So, for instance, when the Civil War took place in the United States, there were many people who said, God is judging our nation for the abomination of slavery. And all of the people that have died in this war are God's judgment upon us for that. Now, that's not something that an academic historian can say, but it's something which a person who is a Christian may say, oh, well, actually, God doesn't like this and we're suffering some consequences, maybe. But I don't think you can go beyond maybe, and I don't think as an academic historian, a historian can say, God was doing this.
Okay. Other questions?
My question to Professor Helo, we often hear from people that God has changed my life, and I was a drug addict, I was a drunkard, or I was not doing well in my life, or I was let's say, a very horrible person or something. We often hear such claims from our friends. It could be my best friend, it could be my brother, it could be my sister, it could be my mom or dad, it could be me. We often hear such claims, and such claims, and they also very firmly attribute such, if you can call it miracles, they attribute such miracles to God, especially the God of the Bible. So what would be a naturalistic explanation to such claims? Is there a psychological claim or psychological explanation or a moral explanation or a scientific explanation to such claims? One can choose not to have an explanation if you're a naturalist. You can choose not to have an explanation. You can stay away from that. But I think it's important to have an explanation to such claims because such claims come from people who are very dear to us. It could be my best friend who I know doesn't ever lie, doesn't normally lie.
Okay, so the question was that when people who we know very well tell that their lives have changed and even have some miracles happen to them, how can it be explained in naturalism?
So I don't know whether I'm a naturalist or not. I would need someone to define me all these terms, and then I would go home and think about that for a month to become with my own definition of it. As it comes to fairly regular human phenomena, things happen to people, bad things, good things. My point was exactly that with questions that deals with your own identity, your self-realization in this world when you grow up, experience the world, get older, you may have very different ideas about yourself throughout your life. Some of them good, some of them bad, and I don't see any miracle in that because that is what happens to people.
I have a very short question for you, Dr. Peter. If I believe in something, if I believe in Christianity, for instance, I take this, do I actually need a science in my life or in the evolution of God? Do I need a science if I believe in something? Or do you justify the existence of science that you need a science with a religion?
Okay, were you asking that if one is a believer, does he need science in his life?
Well, I can rephrase it. I'm not saying that they contradict or something, but if I believe in something 100%, like I say that the sun was created by God and other religious beliefs, then actually I don't need science, I don't need anything. I just stay within my religious domain and be happy throughout my life, and there is no need of science, isn't it? Or there is no need of questions.
Okay, yeah. So if one is a believer, has a strong belief that God has made something, so doesn't it make it so that you don't have to do any science and find out things about how this world works?
If a person believes something strongly enough, obviously they don't need science to believe as strong as they do. Perhaps they need somebody who can counsel them, or perhaps a doctor if they're believing something that's quite irrational. So people can believe that people are out to get them, paranoid. People can believe that without any science giving rise to it, but in that case, it has a negative effect on their life. When people believe things that doesn't have any negative effect on their life, basically we let people go and believe as they believe. But I actually kind of pity that person. And the person is believing something which I think it has no justification whatsoever. And a person who does that in one instance is apt to do it in many instances. So I think it really isn't quite important that one have good reason for believing the things that one believes. One doesn't have to have proof of it. But if a person simply believes something and has no reason whatsoever behind it, it doesn't have to be science. There could be good reasons for believing something beyond what science is able to give. But I think reason is important. Now, there are many people who believe that say God spoke to them, and they just have this feeling. Well, I have a strong enough feeling that God spoke to them. Well, maybe God did. I'm not sure. But if they start saying that God spoke to them and told them that they ought to crash their car, then I say, no, as much as you may believe that, you ought to be more suspicious of that. And particularly when there's negative consequences, we ought to try to intervene. But I think it's important for people to develop self-critical habits so that our beliefs really do line up with things which are reasonable.
Can I have a follow-up question, if you don't mind?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, when you say that you need reasons to believe, or you have to find reasons that your belief is good or right or wrong, there are many historical incidences or records where when you try to find reasons for the beliefs, you have been punished and you have been called paranoid. People were killed, people were given poisons when they had radical ideas and notions that were against people's belief.
Yeah, if you're a Christian, Jesus told us love our enemies, not kill people who are engaged in blasphemy. Maybe I missed it. You didn't get the question recorded.
Actually, I quite
didn't quite get it. You don't want to repeat a little bit, see if we actually got the question, the follow-up question?
I want to repeat. Do you want me to repeat it?
Yes.
Okay, you said that you need to find reasons for your belief, and you don't have to be. You have to justify your beliefs. I think that's what your point was. And there are many historical incidences and instances where there were beliefs, and the radical notions were not justified because one guy says a different thing which is against the social dogma, and he was imprisoned or even poisoned or he was killed because he was trying to be different. And there were no justifications for it. There were no reasons for it. For other people to believe that he was right. But now we know that he was right or he was wrong or whatever. But the common belief, when you believe in something, in the history, people left this space of being skepticism. Are you understanding my question?
I'm not quite, but if you, Peter, you can
Well, it sounds to me as though you're saying people need to have justifications for their beliefs because sometimes they believe something that's quite radical and they believe that, that God has told them to kill the president. You know, when a person has that kind of belief and it's not justified, people can do things that are quite bad if there's not good justification for it. So having justification actually does help restrain some beliefs that could be wild and crazy beliefs. Is that kind of what you're getting at? It sounded to me as though you're agreeing that people ought to have justifications because if they don't, they can do terrible things.
What I think is when you believe in something, you stop reasoning it, you stop questioning it, you stop being skeptic, and when you stop being skeptic, you are going away from the beauty of revelations in science. That's what my question is. Because people have been critical in their reasonings in the past, and they were against the normal belief of the people.
Do you want me to try to summarize that? Okay. The way I heard you say is that when a person comes to believe something, then they give off asking more questions. They just simply follow that. That is sometimes true, that people believe something and they give off, don't question anymore. If you were to say that for a naturalist, you believe naturalism, so therefore you no longer question anymore, the naturalist will say, no, I'm quite open to listening to objections and questions that people have. I think it is true of human personality that human beings don't like to have fundamental beliefs questioned. And if a belief becomes something which is important in your identity, there's a strong temptation of people not to question those beliefs. I think philosophers are different in that we have a high tolerance. In fact, we have almost a compulsion to continue to question. So if a person's a Christian philosopher, they continue to ask that. But having a strong belief does not prevent you from asking further questions, although it does mean that it makes harder for someone else to convince you. But if you have a strong belief, the challenge for the person with a strong belief is to continue to listen carefully. Sometimes people with a strong belief, they don't listen to what someone else actually saying, and that's what's really important.
Back there.
Thank you. Can I be heard down there? Okay. I am a student and I study business, so nothing that is like so close to the topic, and neither do I have otherwise like a lot of knowledge regarding the issue. But I was thinking that I might be very suitable to hear the debate because, like just you were saying, I don't have any strong beliefs taking like either side, any religion or naturalism. I have myself heard like just a few debates, for instance, John Lennon's, because I just saw that he was part of Veritas Forum, and then Christopher Hitchens, and like these few like similar related about this topic. And what I have like problem understanding is the relevance of such debates in practice. I mean, I understand very well like how much they contribute to like the knowledge and to philosophical like worldviews and building on those, but like in practice, what they exactly mean for us. And before I phrase my question, I have a yes or no question to make sure that I understood both parties right, because if I didn't understand it right, then I come to the question. So for Ari, my question is this. You said in the beginning of your presentation that is it a problem for a person to be like both religious and then like a scientist, to be in the academic field? And you said it depends on the view that the person has of God and of science. And I agree very much. Now I want to ask, are you saying, when you say, for instance, that religious worldview doesn't really belong to the university institutions, are you exactly saying that if someone believes in God, if someone is religious, then there is no place for this person in the academic field, and this person cannot become a good academic or researcher? Are you saying that?
Can you repeat a little bit?
Let me quote myself.
Okay, I repeat. The end of the question was that were you, Ari, saying that if one believes in God, there's no room in science for that kind of person to be studying science and doing science?
Yes. My point was that in the academy, we are trying to discuss all kinds of questions even worldviews. But we are trying to discuss them in a way that we all would understand what is this or that person's point of view, why she or he says this or that. Rather than be happy with someone saying that, I believe in God, I believe in miracles, whatever you say, or whatever others say must be wrong. That is simply the problem. And as it comes to whether a religious person can be a good academic, I said exactly that none of this is to say that a person would need to deny one's deepest religious beliefs in order to be a first-rate academic.
Yep. Also, Peter, right. Are you saying that there must be a religious worldview in the higher academic institutions such as universities for academic research to advance?
Okay, so does one has to have a religious worldview in academic doing science?
Yeah, doing science, if what I said is correct, that God has created an exquisitely ordered world that operates according to his laws of physics, that means that whether a person is an atheist or a Christian, they're going to be addressing the same kinds of questions, the same kind of issues. So within science itself, unless you're asking sort of science in the historical standpoint, so if some event took place, then a miracle might enter in. But if you're talking about natural processes, the atheist and the Christian would be doing the same way. Where it does enter in quite obviously to me is when it comes in the area of values. Our values are very much influenced by religious beliefs. And to say religious beliefs can never enter into substantive academic discussion means our values can never enter into substantive academic discussion. But no one would say that. So a humanist would say, okay, my belief that every human being is of equal value with every other human being, that is not a scientific claim, it is a belief that goes beyond science. Whether or not they're religious, should someone be allowed to take a belief which goes beyond science and then advocate that in the academy? And I think most certainly, because values themselves are never part of science itself. But if values are not a part of the academy, then the academy is not having the positive influence and the place of discussing ideas and helping direct society ought to have. We're not just a technical institution giving people technical skills. We ought to also be an institution where ideas are discussed, particularly ideas that affect one another, our values, the things that we stand by. And there's no way of separating out religious influences from non-religious influences. Everyone is influenced that way. Western ethics is deeply influenced by Judeo-Christian ethics. And if you were to separate that and then somehow say, well, it's obvious that every human being is of equal value with every other human being, how is that obvious? But that is a value which we should discuss, and I think that in this case, religious values should legitimately enter in. We should say, okay, that's a religious value. We're not convinced of it as a public entity because it's a religious value. But the fact that it's a religious value doesn't mean that we're not going to take it seriously or consider it for us as a community.
So if both of you are saying that religious people and atheists alike can give contribution to science and can become very well-known scientists, then where exactly is the contradiction between you two? And how does, supporting one side or the other change anything in practice, in policy making?
Who said that we are in the opposite opinion?
Usually it works in a way that, depending, for instance, which side manages to convince the most, then some policy or something changes in practice out of that debate. And I thought it was something like that.
I was teasing, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, so how do you disagree about this thing?
I think we disagree when it comes to skepticism with regard to God doing anything in the world. If a person does believe that God acts in the world, if you're an academic and you could take that serious as an option, then it will have influences. If you say, well, I'll just assume it never does, so I can never consider that possibility, then you're simply dismissing that as an option. So I would say and that when a person brings into the realm of academic discussion a claim that, say, a miracle took place, there are quite special circumstances where that needs to happen. But I wouldn't exclude it from simply saying, well, methodologically, we cannot do that. Methodologically, we ought to be open to whatever evidence there is. But like I said, with a historian applies generally. For a Christian who has a belief that God did something and to say, well, God did it, I'm a little leery of it. Well, they sort of have this conviction. Is there some public reason you can give, not only for atheists, but can you convince other Christians that God in fact told you this and this is what's taking place? So when there's no way of being able to get beyond just the sheer subjective feeling, I think it's probably going to stay that way, and it doesn't have much space in the academy.
Let me say just one thing about values. What I have always found disturbing about thinking about values from the religious point of view, in any sense exclusively, is that you may think of it is fairly common practice, I think, in quite many Western countries, that when a prisoner is reported to have converted to Christianity, he or she is somehow more easily to be pardoned or let out of the prison. And I have always wondered when we will have some such a principle that when a prisoner turns into a Kantian believer, that would have exactly the same effect. This has to do with our values. What it is that we really require for a person to look decent. And this is why I think morality and religion should be kept separate. Atheists can have morality, many of them have very high morality, and so on and so forth. Thomas Jefferson is a good example. He was a deist himself. You corrected me on the pronunciation. But he constantly kept on talking about virtuous atheists. He didn't know very many of them, but he read about them. Holbach, Helvetius, so on and so forth. That was just a comment about this idea about how we should think about values.
Okay, there was one question somewhere over there.
I think that saying that God should be out of university for any research is a little bit of a harsh statement. I'm a physicist, and when you go deep into the fundamental physics, you start to reach the limit of science and to reach the border of philosophy. I have two examples. When you go to quantum electrodynamics, you go to the really fundamentals of physics. You go to really simple breaks of symmetries that lead to the whole complexity of the universe. It's a mathematical design that is extremely beautiful, elegant, and simple, and leads to the whole complexity of the universe. So then you start to make yourself questions. And there's a cosmological problem where God could intervene, could make a direct action, if you want. It's called the fine-tuning problem. The constants of nature, you know, the speed of light, mass of the proton, all those kind of stuff, are fine-tuned in such a way that they make life in the universe possible. If any of those constants were changing by 1 or 2%, the universe would be so radically different and so extreme that life wouldn't be possible into it. So there are really borderline cases in which science leads you to think in the possibility of a God. Not to prove it, but at least to make it appear reasonable. So I wouldn't be so harsh, as harsh as you've been saying. It's not the right place to talk about those things.
Okay, so he was saying that, for example, in physics, when you go really deep in physics, it makes you ask questions about God's existence. How is it so that this fine-tuning and so forth, how did it come about?
Yes, well, one thing about physics is that we don't know how it really works, the universe. What I would think the most important or the most interesting question from my point of view would be what kind of a non-being it is that the universe is extending over all the time. That's the philosophical part of it. But as it comes to natural sciences, I think that the basic point is simply that scientists wonder about the universe as we now find it. And the point is not to answer questions that are beyond the evidence that we now have of it. Pardon me?
The question of the fine-tuning of the physical constants is denied by atheists. Because they are naturalists, and they cannot.
Even that?
I'll respond a little bit, because my PhD dissertation was on fine-tuning. So I know a lot about it. The fine-tuning is, if you look at the basic physical constants and you ask what would the universe look like if they were slightly different, almost any one of them, if they were just 2 or 3% different, they're quite good calculations which indicate we wouldn't have complex structures. The most common response amongst atheists these days is to say, yes, there is an extraordinary fine-tuning from our perspective, but there are vast, perhaps an infinite number of universes. In fact, some ways it's simpler to say there are an infinite number of universes, and if the laws of physics vary from one universe to the next, then surely there will be actually an infinite number of universes that come out surprisingly just right. So therefore, that's the explanation. Now, you're saying, a little brash, why is it that we should give the person the permission to say it's okay in the academy to say there are an infinite number of universes to account for this fine-tuning, but you can't even entertain the possibility that God may have fine-tuned it? In both cases, they're going far beyond anything that we can possibly test. They're metaphysical in the sense they go beyond scientific test. Why is it that we would say, okay, one is a natural explanation, so therefore we can allow it in the academy, but the other is a supernatural explanation, and we can't when both of them are metaphysical in the sense that they're questions which science can't answer? It could be that one could say, we don't know, but in fact, atheists do recognize as a problem, and given atheism, the multi-universe explanation is the best one at hand, so therefore they advocate it, and it'd be a little strange to muzzle them and say, no, you cannot communicate that, or you cannot communicate amongst your friends, or you cannot communicate it to your students. When your students ask you, what about this fine-tuning, all you can say is, we don't know. Very few people are so muzzled that they would not say what they actually think.
You brought up quantum indeterminacy, and I'm slightly confused about the relevance. The laws of quantum physics are really precise. For instance, the measurement principle states that the probability of an outcome is exactly the square amplitude of that configuration, the quantum state. So is it somehow less of a violation of the naturalistic worldview that God nudges probabilities here or there just a little bit, rather than God, let's say, cuts there and see?
Okay, something about quantum physics.
Yeah, if God is manipulating quantum physics everywhere, then that is a major modification on the notion of quantum physics. If in fact God is making modifications, I mean, quantum events are enormous compared to the number of people in this room. The quantum events here are just almost unimaginable in number. The question is, if God in fact works through quantum events, that's one way in which you could work through it. So I think your question is it even a possibility that God could manipulate that, or what was your question?
I'm asking whether it's actually important at all to bring it up, because affecting the world through quantum events is basically just as much of a violation of the naturalistic worldview than affecting the world through classical physics.
It is if the naturalist worldview says there's no outside intervention. So even if you're doing it at the smallest possible scale, it's still an intervention. I mean, if God causes a neuron which is just at the point of firing or not firing, and causes to fire at this moment and rather than that moment, and the difference is a different cascade of neurons that fire and the person has a different thought, Now that is not an exception to the laws of physics and that falls within the realm of what's quantumly possible, but God could do that. And a person says, well, isn't that cheating? I don't know that that happens, but if I have good evidence to believe that God does work, then whether it's through God making a neuron fire that physically could not do, if you actually saw it, it'd be a miracle. If you had a small enough scale, you could see that there's no way this could possibly fire. Whether that's what's happened or whether it's a quantum event, God could work through either way, and it's not up to me to say, well, did he do this? If in fact, which way he did it, if in fact I have good reason to believe that he's acted.
Thank you. One more question. There was over there.
I'd like to ask your opinion about if there is any universal value, especially thinking about human rights, which is declared as universal value by United Nations. But do you think if there is any universal value, and why?
Do you think there is any universal values, and if there is, why?
The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, it was interesting, right after it was signed, and it was signed by a vast number of signers, China and many others signed it. Then they had as a follow-up for representatives of different countries to write justifications of it. And the justifications were all across the board. Nobody agreed on the justifications, even when they agreed on the human right. In some ways, it was actually a little deceptive in that it got interpreted. So what does this human right mean? Well, the Chinese might interpret it different than, say, Americans would interpret it. But I think there are things which are deeply enough connected with who we are as human beings, that there is a natural tendency for us to be attracted to a particular kind of behavior, a particular kind of treatment. There's a natural empathy we have for other people where we appreciate kindness. And so I think even biologically there could be some grounds for human rights. But if you look at all the human rights that are there, I don't think you can give biological justification for all of those. And when one tries to give a justification for it, there's no particular agreement on it. As a Christian, I would have my own justification for it, but then that presumes some things I believe as a Christian.
Okay, I just remind you about the feedback sheets, and you can leave them in the back, the tables in back. And if you want to just talk with each other, we still have 1 hour left for the reservation of this lecture hall, and if there's coffee left, you can take coffee and so on. And if you want to come and talk with Ari or Peter, that's also possible. But now we're ending this discussion session, and I want to thank you, and we will thank also Ari and Peter.